A woman at a craft fair once asked me, quietly, almost like she was worried the question itself might get her in trouble, leaning in close over the table of jams I was selling, whether my husband made all the real decisions in our house, whether there were rules he expected me to follow without question. I remember pausing before answering, not because the question was rude exactly, but because the honest answer is far less dramatic and far more ordinary than what most people seem to assume about marriage in my community. By the end of this video, you'll understand what headship actually means in an old-order Amish marriage, how decisions genuinely get made in a household like mine, and why the popular idea of husbands secretly enforcing rules over their wives doesn't reflect how most marriages I actually know function day to day, however dramatic that idea might sound in a video title somewhere. If you've watched my other videos, you know I'm Rebecca, and you know a little about David by now. This video exists because I get asked some version of that craft fair question fairly often, and I think the honest, unglamorous answer is worth explaining properly rather than letting assumptions fill in the gap. The concept people are usually referring to, whether they know the word for it or not, is called headship, a biblical idea common across many conservative Christian communities, not unique to the Amish at all, drawn from the same scripture many mainstream churches reference too, just interpreted and lived out somewhat differently depending on the tradition. In simple terms, it means the husband holds a certain spiritual responsibility for his household, expected to lead with humility and care, rather than control, answerable to God and to the church for how he treats his family, held to that standard by other men in the community who take it seriously themselves. That's a very different thing from a husband making unilateral rules his wife is expected to silently obey without input or discussion. In practice, in my own marriage, headship looks almost nothing like the popular imagination of it. David and I discuss every significant decision together, whether it involves money, our children's upbringing, or how we handle disagreements with extended family. I remember one particular decision, whether to expand our garden significantly or keep it the size it had always been, that took nearly 2 weeks of genuine back-and-forth conversation before we settled on an answer that satisfied us both, weighing the extra work against the extra produce we could sell at market, talking it through most evenings after the younger children were in bed. That's not the picture of a husband simply announcing a rule and a wife quietly complying with it. What headship actually means in practical daily terms is closer to David carrying a certain final responsibility if a genuine impasse were ever reached, a kind of tiebreaker meant to prevent decisions from stalling out entirely, rather than a license to overrule me whenever he simply prefers a different outcome. In 8 years of marriage, we've reached that kind of true impasse maybe twice, both times over decisions that genuinely mattered, not small daily preferences but real questions about our family's direction, and both times, David's approach wasn't to simply declare his preference and expect me to fall in line. It was to take the extra weight of responsibility for the final call seriously, sitting with it for days rather than rushing to use it, precisely because it wasn't something to be used lightly or often. The idea of secret rules specifically is where I think the biggest misconception actually lives. The behavioral expectations that shape my daily life, modest dress, church attendance, community involvement, aren't secret rules any individual husband invents or enforces privately. They're the Ordnung, the shared set of community guidelines every baptized member of our church, men and women alike, agrees to follow, decided collectively by the church district, rather than imposed unilaterally by any single husband over his own wife, discussed and affirmed together during members' meetings that happen periodically throughout the year. David doesn't get to invent additional private rules beyond that shared community standard, and if he tried to, it wouldn't carry any real weight or legitimacy within our community structure at all, since everyone around us would recognize immediately that it wasn't part of what our church had actually agreed to together. I think what actually confuses outsiders is conflating two very different things: the real, communal structure of church guidelines that apply equally to everyone, and the private, personal dynamic of an individual marriage, which in my own experience and in the marriages of most couples I know closely, looks far more like ordinary partnership than anything resembling secret control. Households vary, of course, the same way they do everywhere, some more traditional in daily practice than others, some couples communicating more openly than others, some husbands naturally quieter or more decisive than others. But the baseline expectation in my community isn't secret male authority. It's mutual responsibility, carried differently by each partner, but shared nonetheless. Each of us accountable to the other and to the community we both belong to equally. If you're wondering what actually happens when David and I do disagree, and how that gets resolved without either of us simply pulling rank or citing some abstract concept to win an argument, stay with me, because I think that's the part people are actually most curious about underneath the original question. When David and I disagree, which happens exactly as often as it does in any honest marriage, we talk it through, sometimes over several conversations spread across a few days, rather than resolving everything in one sitting, walking back to the topic gently once tempers have settled a little. If something feels genuinely stuck, we'll sometimes bring it to an older couple in our community we trust, not for a ruling exactly, but for outside perspective from people who've navigated 40 years of marriage themselves and can often see an angle neither of us has considered in the middle of our own frustration. That's about as far from secret unilateral rule enforcement as I can imagine, closer to how any thoughtful couple anywhere might handle a genuine disagreement, reaching outside their own two perspectives when they've genuinely run out of ideas together. Looking back on that craft fair question now, I understand why it gets asked. Headship is a real word, a real concept, and it can sound out of context like exactly the kind of quiet, hidden male authority people assume defines every conservative religious marriage, especially one as visually distinct as ours, must look to someone passing through a craft fair for an afternoon. But the lived reality, at least in my own home and in the homes of most couples I know closely, is something far more collaborative and far less dramatic than that assumption suggests, built more on long evening conversations and quiet mutual respect than on any single person quietly running the household from behind closed doors. I wish I'd had a clearer, calmer answer ready for that woman at the craft fair, instead of the surprised pause I actually gave her, standing there among the jam jars trying to figure out how to explain 8 years of marriage in the span of a single friendly conversation. Tell me in the comments, is there a concept about your own culture or faith that outsiders consistently misunderstand the way headship gets misunderstood about mine? I'd genuinely like to hear what that is.